Senator Liu and guests, welcome to the joint hearing of the Senate Committee on Public Safety and Budget Subcommittee number 5. We're here today in the midst of historic changes in how California manages its criminal justice system. So the timing of this particular hearing could not be better. We have to look squarely at the things that we need to do to improve the performance of our criminal justice system in California, improve public safety, and be good managers of public money. So as we face the budget decisions that we will be making in the next week, we need to look at what other states are doing and what we might be able to learn from them. Because of the fact that we're going into session in an hour, we had to limit the scope of today's hearing to national trends and to hearing from the Pew Center on the state of their recent report on national trends and best practices in dealing with recidivism. So I'm delighted to welcome today Adam Gelb with the Pew Center on the states. Mr. Gelb directs the Public Safety Performance Project, which helps states advance financially sound, data-driven sentencing and corrections policies that protect public safety, hold offenders accountable, and control corrections cost. Exactly what we are hoping to do here in California. Mr. Gelb will review the April report of this year called State of Recidivism, the Revolving Door of America's Prisons, and how its data and information can help inform our criminal justice and correctional policies, practices, and reforms. At no time in our recent history has this issue been more important. With the convergence of the United States Supreme Court ruling concerning prison overcrowding and the need to release 10,000 prisoners immediately, practically, by October of this year, and over 30,000 long-term, with the recent passage of realignment legislation, and we hope we will have the tax monies to follow the people into the community, and the increasing evidence that traditional strategies are expensive and do not deliver the public safety outcomes our people expect, the legislature has indeed very weighty responsibilities of helping to craft reforms that will lead to improved public safety through cost-effective strategies. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Mr. Gelb. And Senator Liu, do you have anything you want to add?
I just wanted to thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this meeting. I agree with you, this couldn't be more timely as we face a very difficult budget. California faces some very difficult decisions of public safety. So thank you. I look forward to your remarks.
Thank you. Mr. Gelb.
Thank you. Good morning. It is terrific to be here, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Very much appreciate your convening this hearing as well and taking the time to look at what is going on across the country. California often leads the country in terms of trends. In this situation, I think as we're going to see over the next half hour or so, that's not been the case. So I think there are some things going around the country that California can learn from. Let me plead guilty at the outset here. I have a lot of information to cover. I might be talking a little bit fast. I know you're pressed for time, so please, if at any point, if I'm just rolling through too quickly, give me a sign and I'll slow down. I want to start by talking about the long-term trends in the population and costs of the correction system in this country. As this first chart shows, we had an incredible stability of punishment, is what criminologists called it, for almost 50 years in this country. The crime rate fluctuated some, but the incarceration rate was amazingly flat. And then in the 70s and through almost today, there's enormous spike in incarceration in this country. It was about 110 per 100,000 residents. It's now at 500 per 100,000 residents. When you sort of boil down that complicated math and you look at how many adults are incarcerated compared to how many adults there are in the population, that 2.3 million adults behind bars nationally, with 230 million adults in the country, that math becomes pretty easy. That's 1 in 100 adults in this country in prison or jail. And it's often overlooked, but the parole and probation populations have increased just as dramatically as the prison population. Those trend lines are just about as steep. And when you look at both populations, we find now that 1 in 31 adults in this country are under some form of correctional control. That's either prison and jail or probation or parole. This falls disproportionately, of course, on different populations, with the highest rates among young black males. That's between black males between the ages of 20 and 34. 1 in 9 are behind bars. The United States is the world's incarceration leader. We have about 5% of the world's population, and King's College in London, which tracks prison populations around the world, finds that we have 23% of the world's prisoners in the United States. Why has this happened? The short answer is policy choices. It's certainly not been because of an increase in crime. In fact, the crime rate in the United States has been falling since about 1993, the last 18 years or so, with the most recent statistics out from the FBI showing that there was once again a pretty significant year-over-year decrease in crime. So the size of prison population is made up of two factors, and two factors only. There's very complicated stuff going on, but it's how many people go in and how long they stay. And it's decisions that states have made about those two factors that drive the population. Here's one example, folks who can't see this. This is one state where you can be fined up to $1,000 and go to prison for littering. And just in fairness to this particular state, and maybe a little bit relevant to the conversation going on here, you can go to prison in this state with a sentence of 90 days or over, not the traditional split between a year. But nevertheless, this is a state that threatened prison for littering. What's happened with the costs of this? You see that the trend line is similar over the past 20 years. Unfortunately, we don't have good national data that goes back before this period, but the states were spending a little over $10 billion. The most current figures go a little bit beyond where this chart covers, up to about $52 billion in the most recent fiscal year. So from about $10 to $50 billion in overall costs per year. As prior governor here, Governor Schwarzenegger, pointed out, I think in his State of the State address earlier this year, there's been an enormous increase in the corrections spending, wildly disproportionate to how much has been invested over time in higher education. We did a particular look to try to break down that roughly $50 billion in spending to see how much is going to prisons versus probation and parole. Those weren't numbers that have been available. So we did a survey a couple of years ago. And this paints that picture I was mentioning a little bit before, where you have 1 in 100 adults in prison, 1 in 31 under some form of supervision. That means that for about every one person there is in prison, there are about 2 on probation or parole. So, right, so you have that slice of the correctional population is about 1/3 prisons, 2/3 in the community. And that ratio has actually stayed the same despite the massive increase in incarceration we've had. But when we looked at where the dollars are going, almost 9 out of every 10 correctional dollars being spent on the prison population. So you have 2/3 of the population of the community and only about 12% of the funding going to supervise the folks who are out in our streets and in our communities. And further unpacking that, we found that across the country, on average, we're spending about $3.42 a day on probation supervision and about $79 a day on prison, a 23-to-1 ratio. You get costs 23 times as much to have somebody in prison for a day as it is on probation. Now, I was a history major in college, so wait, we're not quite there yet. What have we gotten for all this increase in incarceration and in spending? There is absolutely no question that the increase in incarceration in this country has helped reduce the crime rate. Make no mistake about that. Not only do violent and career criminals deserve to be off the streets and locked up for a long time, but research shows that increased incarceration is responsible or can claim credit for about a quarter, maybe up to 35% for the crime drop that we've seen since the early 90s. But the trends have not at all been uniform, and one way to illustrate that is to take a look at what's happened in two states. As you see from these lines, Florida and New York started roughly the last decade with about the same prison population. New York had a little over 70,000 inmates, Florida slightly fewer than 70,000. By the end of the decade, Florida had joined Texas and California in the so-called 100,000 club with about 103,000 inmates, and New York went the other direction with less than 60. So over this decade, they started the same, and Florida ended up with 40,000 more people in its prisons than New York. Now, what would you expect would have happened with the crime rate? Well, in Florida, it did go down about 28%. In New York, any guesses? It went down too, and actually by slightly more. And in fact, this is sort of something that dominates the national debate on this. People see these two lines. They see incarceration went up, and looking at this particular period, 97 to 07, it went up by 14%, and crime came down. And you see this X chart that is frequently put out there, and it looks pretty simple. It's pretty convincing. Incarceration up, crime down. If you look more deeply and you unpack this, particularly state by level, you see that there were states where both went down, both incarceration and crime went down. This is just an example to simplify a picture that would show that actually there were 19 states that in the last 10 years reduced their incarceration rates, and all 19 of those states also saw reductions in their crime rates. So the point here is not that incarceration, to be very clear, not that incarceration does not help reduce crime. It is simply that states can reduce their incarceration rates and also have less crime. It can happen, and it has happened. Here's the history lesson I was getting to a second ago. If you a quick trip down memory lane. Some 30, 40 years ago, when Ronald Reagan was in charge here, there was a dramatic reduction in the prison population. This is a front page from the Chronicle from 1972 talking about this. And since it's too hard to see, I just pulled out some of the pieces from the article. It's talking about how under the Reagan administration, the prison population dropped from about 29,000 offenders to just about 20. It's about a 30% reduction, which is on the order of magnitude that you're talking about here now with the Supreme Court decision, from 140 some down to 110 some. So percentage-wise, a similar kind of reduction that occurred in the Reagan administration. The article is talking about how the first time in history there are more convicted offenders on parole than in prison, how the recidivism rate has dropped to its lowest level in more than a decade, and would also just point out that while the Probation Subsidy Act was created here before Reagan took office, it was something that very much ramped up under his administration and had this model of the state incentivizing the counties to deal with lower risk offenders. Governor Reagan, in his 1971 address, was bragging on this a bit. What he said was, "Our rehabilitation policies and improved parole system are attracting nationwide attention. Fewer parolees are being returned to prison than at any time in our history, and our prison population is lower than at any time since 1963. So what we see now across the country, stepping back from yesteryear to present day, is that states all across the country, and this is just a sampling, but states led by Republicans and by Democrats, in the Northeast to Nevada, and certainly across the South, where incarceration rates are the highest, we see significant efforts by states to say violent and career criminals need to be off the streets for a very long time, but we need to find more effective and less expensive ways to deal with lower risk nonviolent offenders. So I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. There's an assumption that that all this is going on because of the budget, right? Everybody's under budget pressure, so they need to save money, so they're sort of holding their noses and doing things they think are bad policy because they got to find money somewhere. And I just want to really try to make the case to you that is not the whole story. I won't deny that budget pressure is not part of this, but there are a lot of things going on. I'll spend a few minutes talking through those things with you that sort of set the table. As we've been saying, that budget pressure, yes, is bringing states to the table here, but it's not the meal. So I want to talk about what the meal is. The first thing, the reason why I think policymakers in many other states are moving in this direction is because there's been a lot of improvement in our knowledge about what works to reduce recidivism. We know so much better today than we did 30, 40 years ago when we started down this prison building path. We know so much better about what works to stop that cycle. The first piece is advances in supervision technology. We have GPS monitors, rapid result drug tests, kiosks like ATMs that monitor low-risk offenders. We have ignition interlocks. We have all types of systems that didn't used to exist that can help parole and probation authorities monitor effectively the activities and the whereabouts of offenders in the community. The next piece, we know a lot more about what treatment or rehabilitation programs work. The predominant way that treatment was done 25, 30 years ago, and certainly there's still programs like this that exist today, people sit around in a group and they talk about their problems. Doesn't work so well. What we now know is that cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, and there are other strategies that are much more effective, and research has shown that. The third significant advance is in risk assessment. There have been thousands and thousands, if not millions of offender records analyzed at this point by researchers who have identified what are the key criminal risk factors. We don't have any foolproof way, of course, of predicting future human behavior, but we know a lot better now how to make effective distinctions between who is a high risk, who's a medium risk, and who's a low risk offender, and then what needs to be done with them. The next piece, I think criminal justice is a little bit late coming to this, but across government there's an increasing focus on cost-benefit analysis. People and legislatures in particular are and have for some time becoming more and more interested in what comes out, not just what goes in, how much we're paying, and what kind of services and how many services are being provided to how many people, but is this stuff actually having an impact? And that's now coming to criminal justice as well. There's a recognition that prisons are a government spending program. Just like any other government spending program need to be put to the test of cost benefit. Are taxpayers getting an adequate return on their hard-earned dollars? And then the last piece here that I think is sort of part of setting the table for the reforms going around the country is very supportive public opinion. I'm going to take not a diversion, but I'm going to dig into this here for a couple minutes and talk about some public opinion research that our project at Pew did over the past year or so. So we went to the pollster who worked with John McCain on his campaign public opinion strategies and paired them with Bennett's Strategy Group, which was Obama's lead pollster. They did focus groups in urban, suburban, and rural areas across the country, and And then, in addition to that, we did a national poll. Just quickly here, the sample was really quite an interesting sample. 20% of the respondents reporting that they or a family member had been a victim of a violent crime. Almost half were or have somebody in their family as a victim of nonviolent crime. 17% law enforcement households, and then this 43 to 20 conservative liberal split is very representative of how people identify themselves. Generally along the political spectrum. So it was a nice representative sample that was pulled, and I'm going to just go through some of what was found. No question, voters want a strong public safety system. They want offenders held accountable, but they think that there are lots of ways to do that, and they're eager for ways to do that for nonviolent offenders, short of continuing to build and pay for more prisons. Here's one question. I just want to read it out loud. This was a question we asked: how do you agree or disagree with the following statement? It does not matter whether a nonviolent offender is in prison for 21 or 24 or 27 months. What really matters is the system does a better job of making sure that when an offender does get out, he is less likely to commit a crime. Any guesses as to what the response was to that? Pollsters will tell you that if you get sort of 30 or 40% of folks strongly agreeing on something, that's a very robust level of support. This was a 75% strongly agreeing, essentially, that we spend a lot of time in the policy arena talking about whether somebody's get out in June or July and the implications of this, and folks are a lot more interested. They understand at this point, and they're frankly sick and tired of people getting out of prison and coming back and coming right back again, and they would rather the system shift some of those dollars, as we see in this in an upcoming question here, to stopping and interrupting the cycle of recidivism. Americans think about 22% of inmates could be safely released without impacting public safety. They would like to see a reduction in prison time. Here's a response with 87% overall support for reduction of prison time for low-risk nonviolent offenders and the reinvestment of the savings from that into a stronger parole and probation system that holds offenders accountable for their crimes. And you recall the math of this becomes pretty easy. I think the ratios are similar here in California, but the cost of a day in prison is 23 times the cost of a day on probation. So there's a win-win there in terms of beefing up supervision and contributing to state budget relief. These results were strong across party lines, as you see here, and as well across regions of the country. Very, very little variation in terms of party affiliation and regional in terms of support for the concept of justice reinvestment. Last piece here, and Madam Chair, disappointed that you had abbreviated time this morning, so couldn't focus on SB 678 here, but we very interested and supportive of that performance incentive funding concept, and asked about it in this poll, and respondents thought it was a very top or high priority to reward probation and parole agencies for their success if they increase their success rates. They'd like to see that they understand the concept of rewarding performance at the agency level. It is not just the public. I'm going to shift out of the poll here a little bit, but just point out that we are seeing across the country the business community step up to the plate here and say that if we want our state to have a vibrant, competitive economy, we need to either cut business taxes, or we need to spend more and beef up and improve education or workforce development. We cannot continue to sink an ever-growing portion of our budgets into corrections. I should have said earlier, but I'll say here quickly that when we looked at the cost trend that's now over $50 billion, that corrections has been the second fastest growing category of state budgets, second only to Medicaid. It used to be about 3.5% of state budgets across the board. Now it's about 7%, so $1 in $14. And don't know the ratio here in California, but nationally, 1 in 8 state employees now works in corrections. And so business leaders are seeing figures like this and are joining the conversation, I think, for the first time about the need to do something different.
Excuse me.
Yes, ma'am.
Just out of curiosity, are these business leaders also open to hiring felons?
Some are.
We do have a problem here.
Yep. There's certainly no uniformity on that.
Okay.
I hope you all have heard or seen from the group Right on Crime, which is a nice double entendre. It is some of the leading conservatives in this country. You see their names here. We're talking about Newt Gingrich and Grover Norquist and Ed Meese, William Bennett, David Keene, American Conservative Union, Tony Perkins of Family Research Council. These folks signing on to a set of principles consistent with the kind of reforms we're seeing across the country and urging them on basically from this perspective. Conservatives are known for being tough on crime, but we must also be tough on criminal justice spending. And so whether it's the business community, conservative leaders, or the public at large, we're seeing a significant public opinion and opinion leaders saying now is the time to do something different. So back to this sort of table setting and the window of opportunity that exists on this issue. Once the table is set with all of these other things that have happened, I think that's where you bring in the budget pressure and bring us to the point again where there is in state after state around the country strong bipartisan interest in alternative strategies. What are those things that are happening? They are far too numerous to go through, but we'll just spend a couple minutes on a couple of the most common ones. On the sentencing arena, we see lots of states reclassifying their offense levels. If something is a Class, say, B offense, they're making it a Class C or a Class D. They're also sort of changing things around. We have states saying, well, we only have Class Cs, and the penalties for that go up to 10 years, but let's create a Class D felony and cap the prison time at 3 years. There's also a lot, and some of this obviously has gone on here in California as well, but expansion of eligibility, giving the courts more options to send certain offenders to community corrections, particularly to drug courts. On the back end of the system, a number of states moving to incentivize inmates to complete recidivism reduction programs, give them credit for doing things that will make them less likely to return once they're released, and instructions to parole boards to base their release decisions on validated risk assessments. And then finally, in the community corrections arena, obviously a big one of importance here is, and a lot of states have moved to do this, we'll talk about it in a few minutes, to use various graduated sanctions to hold offenders accountable for violations of the rules of their probation or parole rather than revoking them to prison. And a number of states are exploring and also working on the performance incentive funding model that is embodied in Senate Bill 678, as well as providing incentives to offenders on probation and parole, taking that concept of earned time out from behind the walls and saying to probationers and parolees, if you're compliant, you're doing what you're supposed to do, you're testing clean, you're current in your victim restitution, then you too can earn time off of your supervision period, which is a real nice piece because it both provides a nice positive incentive for the offenders, but then helps probation and parole agencies clear those low-risk compliant offenders off their caseloads so that they can then focus on the offenders who are higher risk and who are messing up, and exactly the people who do need the time and attention. I want to spend a few minutes on what is probably the most significant and important example of these kind of reforms across the country, and that is in the state of Texas, which I think you all would agree is probably the very symbol of law and order in this country. Texas is tough, and everyone knows it. And so I'll just spend a few minutes talking about what's happened in Texas. In 2007, Texas Texas has a biennial legislative session. In 2007, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice came in and said, we've been growing. We think we're going to continue to grow over the next 5 or so years. By 2012, we're going to need up to another 17,000 beds. Now, this was after they had already added, over the previous 20 years, 100,000 beds. So this is a little stylized graph here, but they'd gone from about 50,000 to 150,000 beds from 1987 to 2007, and they were going to continue that same track. And they, I guess you could say, they sort of borrowed a line from Nancy Reagan and said, no. They just said no. We're not going to do it. And with help from our project and the Council of State Governments Justice Center, a bipartisan team got together to look at what else they could do. We analyzed the situation, found they had a high recidivism rate, particularly on account of the revocation of technical violators, and that their parole grant rate was low. Those were some of the key drivers of the population in Texas. You had a conservative Republican from Plano, who is chair of the House Corrections Committee, get together with a Democrat on the Senate side from Houston, who is the dean of the Senate, and across the aisle crafted a plan to, rather than go along with the Corrections Department plan to build up to 70,000 new prison cells, to make a dramatic expansion of residential diversion and treatment centers, and to also instruct the parole board to increase its grant rate. Here's a picture of what happened. The red line at the top was what the Corrections Department was projecting would happen, that upward trend would basically continue as it had. What actually happened, and this line actually holds to present day, actually flattened out that population growth. I mean, Texas has stopped its prison growth in its tracks. That is, of course, not the be-all and end-all of this. So let's look at these other pieces. They have saved what would have been, over the 5-year period, almost $2 billion. They've averted those costs. The parole recidivism rate is down 25%. And I think most importantly on here, the overall state crime rate is back down to the levels it was in the early 1970s. The Texas legislature finished up about 9 days ago. I think it was last Monday or Tuesday. And once again, they did this in 2009, but once again this year, despite a massive budget deficit in Texas, I think they're about $15 billion in the hole. I think a lot of us thought that some of those programs that were working, that were serving as alternatives for the courts and for the supervision agencies to use as graduated sanctions rather than sending people back in prison, those programs were going to be cut, right? What's easier to cut than sort of programs for offenders? They didn't cut practically a penny from these programs. They retained what was a $120 million a year investment in alternative programs. I want to shift now. I know, Madam Chair, we're getting tight on time. So I'm going to shift to our recidivism report that you mentioned that came out in April. It was the first of a...
We need to get the information.
I'm okay? All right. Well, we're getting close to the end. I was hoping actually to take up enough time so I didn't have to try to answer any questions about California. You'd think there'd be better data on this, and frankly, it's disappointing that there's not sort of a common definition across the country for what recidivism is and how to measure it. And we were a little bit crazy when we decided to try to construct such a thing, but that's what we did, working with the Association of State Correctional Administrators. We wanted to try to get as close as possible to an apples-to-apples comparison about this critical question. How many offenders are returning to prison within 3 years of release? We looked at release cohort from 1999 and 2004. I hate that we're here in 2011 talking about this and released the report only then, but I think that's just mostly a measure of how difficult this was to do and how long it took us working with the states and doing a lot of back and forth to try to make sure that the survey questions, these uniform definitions, were adhered to and so on. So I wish we had more current data, but that when we started, it was going to be current. we asked the states in this critical question to distinguish between returns for new crimes and technical violations, and as I mentioned, we tried to construct something that would give us an apples-to-apples comparison as much as possible. But just want to acknowledge to you all that there are plenty of asterisks and footnotes in here because states just simply have their own data systems and ways of counting things and couldn't always meet the requirements of the survey. So, what did we find? We found widely disparate trends, as you might imagine. This first set of states is those that saw, and it doesn't look like that's the numbers are showing up too well here. So hopefully the shading will help, and I think we have copies of the report that have been distributed where you'll be able to see this. But these dark blue shaded states are states that saw over that period, the 94 to 2007. 2004 to 2007 period, right? You follow inmates for 3 years. We looked at a 2004 release cohort, so these were inmates who were followed through 2007. These blue states saw significant decreases in their recidivism rates. This next crop of states, and again, you see this is sort of all across the country. There's no sort of regional pattern here. These were states that saw more modest decreases, but decreases nonetheless in their recidivism rates. This next series actually saw increases in the recidivism rates, and these red states saw 10% or larger increases in their recidivism rates. There's a lot of discussion, of course, about the relationship between the economy and recidivism rates. If inmates can't get out and find jobs, as we discussed briefly a second ago, how are they going to make it? Not trivializing that issue at all here, but there are obviously lots of other things that are important in this in that question because, as you see, there are no real regional patterns that would suggest particular economic links to these changes in outcomes over time. We highlighted a couple of states in the report that had shown pretty substantial progress. One is your neighbor to the north, Oregon, which did a number of things to improve its community supervision operation, including requiring that community corrections programs use evidence-based practices and that their funding go to fund programs that research has shown works. Through those means and of course several others, they were able to reduce the red bar you see there, which is the number, sort of the rate of inmates coming in coming back for new crimes. They also cut in half the already fairly small number of inmates coming back for technical violations, and overall had one of the best recidivism, meaning lowest recidivism rates in the country. Michigan, pretty different strategy, held about even on the new crimes, but saw a pretty dramatic reduction in technical violations. Michigan has done a lot of work through a program called the Michigan Prisoner Reentry Initiative around coordination of services for offenders when they return to the community. Michigan's numbers actually look even better when you bring them up to current day. There's been even significant progress in the last couple of years. Here's California, and I think the bars tell the story, but just to hit the point, this state is about in the middle of the pack, even probably a little bit better with respect to the number of inmates coming back for new crimes. What really stands out here is the blue bar here, right? Is the number of inmates that are being sent back to California prisons for parole violations, and obviously you all are well familiar with that story here. I think our report adds a little bit of context to it in the sense that we didn't really know, I think, until this report, sort of how much sort of the states stuck out as a sore thumb. Obviously, just in this presentation, don't have room to show you all the states, but if you look at the full-page chart with the 40-plus states that we were able to collect data from in this report, you will see how far out of whack that technical violation rate is. We just did a little calculation here about what the savings would be if the states with the most significant rates of return and numbers of offenders reduced or increased their success rates, a better way to put this. And so a 10% reduction in recidivism in these states would combined save almost $500 million. And California, obviously, with your numbers, would save a tremendous amount of taxpayer dollars with a relatively modest reduction in the recidivism rate. We highlighted in the report some strategies for reducing recidivism. We tried to not tread over a lot of the same ground that other reports have. There's been some fantastic reports that we cite in the report, including a report that came out of a Justice Reinvestment Summit that Congressman Frank Wolf held a little over a year ago in Washington. And the report that came out of that was put together by our partners at the Council of State Governments Justice Center, so that focused on many different facets of recidivism reduction. In this report, we focused on 5 in particular. Defining success as a measure, defining recidivism reduction as a measure of success. It seems rather obvious, but I think you all are probably familiar that has not really been the mission of correctional agencies, and certainly not necessarily of the courts. And we find through our partnership with the National Center for State Courts, as well as with corrections directors around the country, a growing embrace of this as a mission, rather than simply keeping the inmates behind the walls or making sure that the institutions are safe and meet constitutional conditions of confinement and so on. All critical objectives, but recidivism reduction needs to be affirmatively added to the list. Part of that, of course, is the notion that you don't want to wait until somebody's just about to leave before you start to prepare them for release. You want to optimize the use of supervision resources. There are a number of ways to do this, but I'll just use some quick research to illustrate how important it is. And this is from the National Research Council that did a look at sort of how long after release is it that inmates recidivate. And this is a long chart that covers a long period of time, but the bottom line here is you see the fairly steep drop, particularly for drug and property offenders, in those curves, which means that they are much more likely to recidivate, right, in the period after release, in the first year or so after release, and so obviously that's where you want to focus the supervision efforts. But supervising people for longer periods of time will have less and less or diminishing returns in terms of the impact on recidivism. The next piece, impose swift and certain sanctions. Too often, on both the probation side and the parole side, we have a system that sort of violates everything we know about how to shape behavior, which is that we allow it time after time again for people to break the rules, and then at some arbitrary point that's not clear to anybody involved, somebody says, okay, that's enough. We're taking you back to the judge or to the parole board, and we're going to put you back in prison. It's sort of an all or nothing system, when we know that the best way to shape behavior is to have a certain and a swift response for each and every violation of the rules. There is a program in Hawaii called HOPE that has really operationalized this notion of swift and certain sanctions and really operationalized what we know about deterrence. And you see the sort of the stunning results that the HOPE program has achieved. I'll just describe it very quickly. It's a program that was started by a former federal prosecutor there, Judge Steve Alm. He's now on the bench, and he came in and saw this system I just described, that we're just not doing anything with these people until it's time to revoke them. And he set up a system with very simple rules. We're going to drug test you a couple times a week, and if you're dirty, you're going to jail for a couple days. No ifs, ands, or buts. It's on you from now. It's not going to be about whether I like you or I'm having a bad hair day or what have you. These are the rules, and now you're in charge of your own destiny. And obviously, this is not going to work for everyone, but as you see from the results here, it is having a significant impact. These are results from a randomized controlled trial, and people were literally randomized into control group, business as usual, and the group on the testing and sanctions regime. You see reductions of more than 50%, right? Cutting arrests by more than half, cutting drug use by well more than half, by 70%. They're showing up for much more likely to show up for their probation appointments, and obviously much more likely to be revoked and using substantially less jail time. So it's exciting. If you all don't know, I suspect you do, but the parole agency here in the state has picked up on this model and is working on a pilot. It was very encouraging to see that and working the kinks out before bringing it to scale. It'd be very exciting to see it expand here in California on the probation side as well. Finally, we talked about this a little bit before, but we're seeing a lot of success with the creation of incentives for offenders to succeed. I described it a little bit earlier, but want to show you some results from the state of Arizona, which in 2008, again with some help from our project and the Council of State Governments Justice Center, put in two incentives, one at the system level, one at the offender level. At the system level, they put in something that looks very much like Senate Bill 678, and at the to incentivize the probation agencies to send fewer violators back. And then at the offender level, they it almost sounds like I'm joking about this, but they gave probationers 20 days off for every 30 days they were in compliance. So they said to probationers, if you do what you're supposed to do for a month, we'll whack 20 days, so almost a day for a day, not quite off their sentences. When that bill was introduced, we were reasonably sure that was going to be a sort of an opening, bargaining position, and that by the time it got through the Arizona legislature, it was going to be down to, if it got through, it was going to be down to 5 days a month or something like that. It actually went through at 20 days, and I don't want to make it seem like these two things have had magical impact. I mean, the Arizona Administrative Office of the Courts, which oversees probation, has spent a long time moving toward evidence-based practices and doing a whole range of things. But between that and the legislation in 2008, you see what are dramatic reductions in revocations. I think most importantly, because the bottom line, for us and certainly for you, is a reduction in crime. And when you have a significant, over 2 years, drop of new felony convictions of probationers of 31%, something important is going on, right? This is not about whether probation is actually, right, sort of turning a blind eye to violations and simply saying, yeah, let's not revoke this guy to prison, because if we don't, then our numbers will look good and we'll get that incentive funding from the state. This is actually measuring what's happening. Are these guys getting arrested? Are they committing new crimes? Are they being convicted of new crimes? So we find it very, very convincing evidence, and folks around the country are very interested in what is happening in Arizona. So I appreciate your time and attention. I threw a lot at you here. Obviously, the crossroads here in California, there's a tremendous amount going on. I think exciting opportunity for this state to do what so many others are doing right now, which is to get taxpayers a better public safety return on their corrections dollars. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I have a question. There may be comments or questions from other members of the committee. We've been joined by Senator Kern Price and Senator Joel Anderson, who's the vice chair of both committees. Yeah. Both Public Safety and the Budget Subcommittee. I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the role of in-prison time in terms of rehabilitation or education, and what happens in prison and how it blends with what happens outside of prison, how the transition is made in terms of the states that have successfully reduced recidivism.
I think there's a very understandable...
Oh, okay, there.
Thanks. I think it's a very understandable sort of public impulse to say that when people go to prison, they should just simply do their time. prisons shouldn't be places where they have education or other kind of programming. There was a governor a few years ago who said he thought that the purpose of prison and that all the inmates should be doing behind the walls is moving a stack of rocks from one side of the yard to the other side of the yard, and when the stack was over here, they should just pick them up and put them back down on the other side of the yard. That's how they should spend their time. I think what we're seeing around the country is again this recognition and frustration on the part of the public as well as policymakers that they want to see the cycle of recidivism stop, and they know that means that people need to be doing things behind the walls that can help them succeed when they return. To sort of more directly answer your question, my best understanding of the research is that it is more important what goes on in the community to ultimate recidivism outcomes than what happens behind the walls. You don't want inmates sitting idle for a whole host of reasons behind the walls. But sort of if you had to choose, if I've got $1 to put in and I want to reduce recidivism, do I want to put it behind the walls or do I want to put it in the community? You will get a significantly better impact by investing that $1 in the same program in the community than you would behind the walls.
It's interesting. That actually would add to the argument for realignment then, for people to be moved out more quickly but into more supportive programs in the community?
Well, I think so. I mean, there's a balance, and I don't want the way I just put that to give you the impression that there shouldn't be anything going on behind the walls. In fact, one of the tenets of our strategy was obviously preparing inmates for release from the moment they enter. So there's got to be a balance. I don't know if anybody's calculated the optimal balance, but often we've seen that there's a tendency to favor the in-prison programs to the exclusion of the others. I'm just trying to make the point that here that you'll have an opportunity to decide where vast sums of money appear to be under discussion about how it will be used, and you want to think very carefully about how that is split between prison and community programs.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments from members of the committee? Senator Anderson.
May I get a copy of your presentation?
Absolutely.
Great. Also, as moving forward, were there particular crimes that were better suited for this? Were sex offenders as easily transitioned as perhaps some drug offenses? What is your experience in that?
Right. So I would say two things. One is that as we and our partners at CSG and the Vera Institute and others that we work with in the states we approach our work in the states from a completely agnostic perspective with respect to any of those type of issues. When you get offense specific, we certainly don't come in making recommendations that you look at your sex offender population and see who can be transitioned to community programs. I mean, there's not a whole lot of interest in that, as there shouldn't be. So most of the activity in the series of states that I reference is focused on drug offenders and property offenders. And changes in the statutory schemes, the penalty ranges, the offense classes, eligibility for community corrections, and so on. The second thing, I guess, that I'd want to say is that what we are trying to do, and I think the way the field is moving in terms of researchers and practitioners, is trying to move away from thinking about a lot of these issues based on the current offense. You have a system here that is very much based on we're going to handle somebody based on whether they were shoplifter this time or they were a residential burglar or whether or not they committed an armed robbery. And I think what the research has really shown is that, as you might sort of suspect, but it's really sort of convincing in the research here, that your current offense is not necessarily, it's an important piece of determining whether you're a high or medium or a low risk offender, but it's only one piece. And obviously you have to look at the prior criminal record and a lot of the other factors that the research has identified as being criminal risk factors, not the least of which are things like poor impulse control, antisocial values, personality type where you always think you're the victim, and society's out to get you, and so on. And these kind of things that are much more important to sort of determinations about really who should go where and how do you get the right people in the right places than looking at it at just a current offense perspective. Was that helpful? Was that what you were?
Actually, I'd just like, could you elaborate a little bit more on, and what is the most effective way to deal with those factors? Poor impulse control, victimization mentality. What are the other factors, and how do those get dealt with in a way, an inside or outside prison, that would lead to to fixing them?
Well, let me give this a try. I think there's probably some folks here who are going to not think I should be teaching a class in cognitive behavioral therapy, but if I could just seize on that as an example, you have in risk assessment, there are a lot of different facets of it, but you have what are referred to as dynamic factors and static factors, and when you blend those two together, you get sort of an overall risk score. The static factors are things that are static; they don't change. They are things like age at first arrest. Right? If you were arrested the first time when you were 9, that's not a good sign. And there's certainly the length and depth and severity of your criminal history. So those are things, obviously, right, that don't change. The dynamic factors, and this is where there's some real hope. I didn't elaborate this on the window of opportunity, but this is where there's some real hope in terms of the new treatment and therapies and strategies that are there, because we actually do know fairly well, much better than we did, right, how to help people with poor impulse control, how to deal with the antisocial values, how to avoid the people, the places, and the things that trigger their either drug use or bad behavior. I'll give you 2 quick examples. One is motivational interviewing. The other is cognitive behavioral therapy. And motivational interviewing is a completely different strategy. 20 years ago, when I talked about people sitting around in groups, that was a confrontational strategy. People were told that they were doing wrong, and they were, I don't know if they said you were bad people, but essentially that was a message. This is a very different strategy in which a probation or parole officer or treatment provider is going to try to find things that are positive in a person's life and try to help build on them. It's not a confrontational piece. It's actually a listening mode. It's actually a different way to communicate with people, and it just works better, particularly with this population. People want to know that they're being listened to, and a therapist will repeat back to the offender what the offender is saying, so that the person knows that they're being heard. That's just it's a quick and pretty inadequate description of motivational interviewing, but it's a powerful communication skill that is being taught more and more to folks working with offenders. Cognitive behavioral therapy is much more robust in that it basically says, we don't, this whole approach we've had of trying to sort of think that offenders were doing what they were doing because of low self-esteem, which is not a criminal risk factor. Poor impulse control is. Low self-esteem, no. But we have a lot of self-esteem building programs out there, right? They're not likely to reduce recidivism. So, but sort of trying to fix low self-esteem, trying to repair somebody's relationship with their mother, all these things that sort of a psychoanalysis, they don't really help. What does help is very practical situational strategies that help people sort of maximize the positive influences in their lives and minimize the negative. So in a very practical way, if you get your check on Friday afternoon and your habit is that you're going to go see Richard and you're going to score, and next thing you know, it's going to be Monday at noon, and you've missed Monday morning at work because you've been whacked out all weekend. Specifically, and this is the treatment, it's not about big, psychodynamic issues. Specifically, what are you going to do Friday afternoon other than go see Richard? Right? What specifically is your plan? Let's make the plan. Let's make the arrangements. You're going to go see somebody else. You're going to go do something else. If Richard happens to call and you happen to pick up the phone, what are you actually going to say? And you practice that in treatment. Again, to just sort of hate to do the support to Nancy Reagan again. It's not just say no, but it's actually how to say no and practicing saying no. How is this conversation going to go? What's it going to look like? And so on. I should stop talking about cognitive behavioral therapy. It's just very interesting. I find it very interesting stuff, and it's very different from really from how sort of interventions have been done. And if it's done well, it's hard to do well, right? It's hard to teach people to be really good at motivational interviewing, and it's hard to take a sort of a whole field that has been focused on one sort of form of therapy and talk about, it's not about this deep stuff. It may be about the deep stuff, but we don't really know how to fix that stuff. What we can do, and which we can do pretty effectively with a decent number of offenders, is help them with these practical strategies and thinking through how to avoid the people and the places and the things that get them into trouble.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other comments or questions, Senator Price?
Yeah, really appreciated the presentation. A lot of good information in a short period of time. You mentioned there was a couple of references to the community correction models that are kind of out there, especially as it relates to pushing the rehab services in the community earlier and more effectively. There was some discussion about Texas, but other states. Are other states doing things that are really innovative in that way, utilizing community-based institutions more effectively?
Oh, very, very, very much so. I think each of the states on that list has done a large variety and combination of measures. I guess I'd want to take the opportunity to mention the state of Mississippi at this point. Not for any particular program they've done, although there is one thing. But while the Texas story is I think the most important one, I'm not sure that the Texas reforms were the most dramatic in terms of changing sentencing and release policy. What happened in Mississippi in 2008 was that the state rolled back its requirement that all offenders serve 85% of their sentences, all offenders, violent and nonviolent alike, and said for nonviolent offenders, we're rolling it back to 25%. Right? And we've been in some states where there are huge arguments about, are you going to go from 85% to 80%? And Mississippi said, let me just say a couple things about this. The federal government in 1994, as part of the crime bill, right, incentivized states to require 85%, require violent offenders to serve 85% of their sentences as part of the big 1994 Crime Act. You would get federal prison dollars if you enacted that requirement. So a number of states did, and Mississippi sort of one-upped them by saying, well, we're not going to just require 85% for the violence. We'll require it across the board. So they passed that in 1995, the year after the crime bill was signed. 13 years later, their prison population had skyrocketed, and that they wanted to do something different with the money. I guess just for emphasis, Texas did what it did in 2007. Mississippi, I'm describing here, did what it did in 2008. These were both long before the bottom dropped out of the economy, right, which didn't happen until the fall of 2008. So we talked about the budget pressure and where that fits in here. These two very significant reforms that occurred in the Deep South occurred before we had economic trouble and before they had to save money in this way. So we took a look. We didn't have anything to do as a project with the Mississippi reforms that were signed in the spring of 2008 by Governor Haley Barbour. But we took a look back, and in the first 14 months after that law took effect, Mississippi had released 3,100 inmates earlier than they would have under the 85% requirement. And they didn't release them on average a couple weeks or a few days or even a few months earlier. The average release in Mississippi occurred 13 months earlier than it would have under the old law. So there were a lot in a state the size of Mississippi, 3,100 inmates. You could probably do some quick math and figure out what the what the equivalent number would be here in California, and they had a very low recidivism rate. They had, out of those 3,100 offenders, they had 121 of them come back in that period, 116 for technical violations, and 5 for new crimes. Like there were 4 DUIs and a burglary, or 4 burglaries and a DUI, which is nothing to, it's nothing to sneeze at, but it's a very low recidivism rate. We're trying to get more current numbers about what has happened. And one of the reasons, certainly what they attribute the success of that reform to was, and this was one of the pieces we had in one of the slides, was the adoption of a new risk assessment instrument at parole. So in other words, they didn't just say, well, everybody was doing 85%, now we can let them out at 25, so we'll let everybody out at 25. They used a risk assessment instrument and to decide where in there is somebody going to get out. And it seems to have worked pretty well, right? They're making pretty good, I don't know if you want to call them bets or guesses or judgments or decisions about who to let out when. And obviously we're keeping, I think the actual average over that period, length of stay or percent of sentence served was about 50%. So they were keeping some in still longer, but they had the discretion to let the lower risk folks out earlier, and mostly those lower risk folks were not coming back.
Thank you. You know, we have been called into session. This is unfortunate. I mean, there's so much more that we could cover, and I'd hope to also hear comments from the public. If any of you do have comments or feedback from the presentation, the committee would love to hear them. If you have suggestions for what we might do, you've given us an excellent foundation for the work that is really just beginning here as we look at our restructuring of our criminal justice system. Thank you so very much. We may want you to come back at some point and go into some of these subjects in greater depth. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.